in the steel and glass canyons of Chicago, where fortunes were forged in blast furnaces and traded in hushed, wood-paneled rooms, one name was a thunderclap in a library: Arthur Sterling. He was the third-generation titan of Sterling Industries, a sprawling empire of American manufacturing. His wealth was a matter of public record, but his temper was the stuff of private legend, a brutal, soul-crushing force that could vaporize a multi-million-dollar deal or a man's confidence with a few precisely chosen, venomous words. Executives with decades of experience would physically tremble before entering his office. Competitors planned their strategies around his predictable volatility. Everyone in his orbit learned the cardinal rule: you do not provoke Arthur Sterling. You endure him. Until a cold Thursday evening at the Empyrean, a restaurant so exclusive it didn't have a sign, only a reputation. There, a 22-year-old waitress named Clara Sullivan, whose hand smelled faintly of turpentine from her secret life as an artist, and whose spirit was frayed by the relentless demands of a life she hadn't chosen, decided she was done enduring. This is not a story about a prince and a pauper. It is the story of the day a hurricane made of money and rage slammed into a cliff made of quiet, unyielding dignity. The Empyrean was less a restaurant and more a sanctuary for the city's old guard. The light was low, the leather was worn and deep, and the silence was punctuated only by the clink of heavy silver and the murmur of billion-dollar conversations. For the staff, it was a nightly performance of invisible perfection. And tonight, the star of the show, the dark sun around which all other bodies nervously orbited, was Arthur Sterling. His arrival was a silent alarm. Jean-Pierre, the maître d', whose composure was legendary, suddenly looked like a man who'd misplaced a priceless artifact. The bar staff polished already gleaming glasses with a new fervor. Sterling didn't command a table. He annexed it. He sat in his customary alcove, a fortress of dark wood and plush leather, a man alone, but occupying the space of 10. He wasn't loud. The menace of Arthur Sterling was in his stillness, in the predatory intensity of his gaze. His eyes, a startlingly pale grey, were like chips of granite. They saw everything and approved of almost nothing. Clara Sullivan was 4 hours into a 12-hour double shift. A dull, persistent ache radiated from the arches of her feet, a familiar companion on the long journey from her tiny apartment in Pilsen to this gilded cage. But her mind was elsewhere, in a small, meticulously clean room at a rehabilitation facility where her younger brother, Leo, fought a daily, silent war against the creeping paralysis of a rare degenerative nerve disorder. The bills for his specialized physical therapy were a mountain of ice she had to climb every month, and her job at the Empyrean, with its lucrative but soul-crushing tips, was her only ice axe. Every flawlessly presented plate, every refilled water glass, every polite, self-effacing smile was a blow struck in her private battle. So when Jean-Pierre approached her, his face a mask of polite dread, she knew the relatively smooth current of her evening was about to hit a waterfall. "Clara," he whispered, his French accent thickening with stress. "Monsieur Sterling's section. Eleanor has a migraine. You are the best I have. You know the protocols." Clara's heart didn't sink. It solidified into a cold, heavy stone in her chest. The Sterling protocols, an unwritten manual for navigating a minefield. Approach from the left. Do not make eye contact unless he initiates. Speak only to confirm. His order was an unchangeable catechism. Sazerac, 2 dashes of Peychaud's, precisely 1 of Angostura, served in chilled glass with a single large ice cube. Then, the 1982 Chateau Margaux, to be decanted at the table with the reverence of a religious rite. He would study the wine, not drink it, for at least 20 minutes. Never ever ask if he is enjoying himself. Observe, anticipate, and vanish. She took a slow, centering breath, the kind she used before starting a difficult charcoal portrait, and slipped on her professional armor. Of course, Jean-Pierre. Her first approach was a masterclass in unobtrusive service. She prepared the sazerac at the tableside cart, her movements economical and precise. He didn't look at her, his attention fixed on a thick, leather-bound report on the table, his fountain pen making sharp, angry annotations in the margins. She placed the cocktail down without a sound. She presented the wine, displayed the label for a perfunctory glance he didn't give, and began the decanting process, the deep garnet liquid flowing in a silent, steady stream. For 45 agonizing minutes, she was a ghost in a black apron, a silent cog in the machine of his solitude. She was serving the main course to an adjacent table of real estate moguls when she heard it. A sharp, resonant tink of a glass being tapped by a fingernail. It wasn't a request. It was a summons. She turned, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. Arthur Sterling was staring at the half-empty wine glass in his hand. He swirled it once, then lifted his granite eyes to meet hers. The cold indifference was gone, replaced by a gathering storm of pure, undiluted fury. "Is everything to your satisfaction, sir?" Clara asked, her voice a carefully modulated whisper. He gestured to the glass with a flick of his wrist, a gesture of profound contempt. "Satisfaction. Young woman, what I am is insulted." His voice was low, but it cut through the restaurant's ambient hum like a razor. "I have been drinking this specific vintage for over 30 years. I know its soul. I know its every note, from the black currant on the nose to the whisper of cigar box on the finish." "This," he said, pushing the glass an inch forward, "is not the 82. It's the 83, a vastly inferior year. A pathetic attempt at deception." Clara looked at the deep red wine. She had been the one to retrieve it from the cellar. She had checked the label, the cork, the ullage. It was perfect. The sommelier had confirmed it. "Sir, I can assure you, I personally brought the bottle from the cellar. It is the 1982. "Are you calling me a fool?" he hissed, the words slithering across the table. The nearby conversations faltered and died. The performance had a new, unscheduled scene, and everyone was now a captive audience. "Or are you suggesting that my palate, which can differentiate between 1/10 of a percentage point in alloy composition in my steel mills, cannot tell the difference between a masterpiece and a mediocre copy?" A hot, familiar anger began to prickle at the back of Clara's neck. It was the same impotent rage she felt when insurance administrators questioned Leo's doctor's reports, when they reduced his life to a series of billing codes. But here, in this temple of obscene wealth, it felt sharper, more personal. "No, sir," she said, her training desperately trying to reassert control. "I am simply stating a fact. Perhaps there is a subtle variation in this particular bottle. I will bring the sommelier over immediately." She reached for the glass, intending to remove the offending object and de-escalate, but his hand shot out and clamped around her wrist. The grip wasn't brutal, but it was absolute, a manacle of cold, controlled power. His skin was dry and cool, like stone. "Do not touch it," he commanded, his voice dropping even lower. "I want you to stand here and comprehend the magnitude of your incompetence. You work in what is meant to be the finest restaurant in this city, and you try to pass off this swill. Is there no pride left in craftsmanship? Or are you simply too lazy, too uneducated to care about the details?" His words were no longer about the wine. They were about her worn but polished shoes, her tired, intelligent eyes, her life, which he clearly assumed was a careless, detail-free existence. And in that precise moment, something inside Clara Sullivan, something that had been stretched taut by worry, abraded by condescension, and worn thin by exhaustion, finally snapped. It wasn't a grand, cinematic decision. It was a quiet, internal rebellion that began in her aching feet and surged up her spine like a current. She looked down at his perfectly manicured hand on her wrist, then up at his arrogant, handsome, and utterly miserable face. She thought of Leo, strapped to a machine, fighting his own body with a quiet courage this man could never imagine. She thought of the sketches in her worn portfolio, the hours she spent trying to capture the truth of a person's face, the dignity in a stranger's posture. She thought of all the tiny, crucial details she observed every day, details this man in his fortress of wealth was completely blind to. And she had had enough. With a slow, deliberate twist, she pulled her wrist from his grasp. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly, a flicker of surprise at the resistance. Then she did something no one in the history of the Empyrean had ever done. She didn't apologize. She didn't scurry away to fetch a superior. She stood her ground. She met his furious gaze with a calm, analytical fire of her own. "My craftsmanship, sir," she began, her voice shockingly clear and steady, "involves a level of detail you can't see. For instance, I noticed that our sommelier, Mr. Gable, has a slight tremor in his left hand tonight because his wife is in the hospital. I noticed he held the corkscrew at an awkward angle, causing a microscopic flake of cork, no bigger than a grain of sand, to fall into the wine as he opened it." A collective, silent gasp seemed to be sucked from the air around them. Jean-Pierre looked like he might actually collapse. Arthur Sterling's face, which had been a mask of imperious rage, now showed a crack of genuine disbelief. Clara leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial tone. "That tiny flaw, which you are too proud to admit you can't identify, is what's disrupting the palate. You're not tasting an inferior vintage. You're tasting Mr. Gable's fear for his wife. You're tasting a tiny, human mistake. But it's easier to blame the wine, isn't it? It's easier to blame me." She picked up the half-full, multi-thousand-dollar bottle of wine from the table. "You talk about pride and details, but you see nothing. You see a waitress. You don't see a person who works 70 hours a week to keep her brother in a therapy program that you could fund with the interest you make while sleeping. You don't see someone who understands that the most important details aren't on a label, they're in people's lives." She then tilted the bottle and, with a steady hand, poured the remaining wine directly into the silver ice bucket next to the table. The rich, dark liquid swirled and vanished into the icy water with a gentle splash that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. "There," she said, placing the empty bottle back on the table with a soft, definitive click. "Now there is no doubt. The wine is ruined." She straightened her apron, her hands trembling, but her resolve as solid as the marble floor beneath her. She looked Arthur Sterling directly in the eye, a 22-year-old artist and caregiver looking at a man whose net worth exceeded the GDP of a small country. "And I quit." She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving behind a drowned vintage, a stunned billionaire, and the profound, echoing silence of a performance that had been spectacularly, irrevocably rewritten. As she pushed through the swinging doors into the chaotic symphony of the kitchen, she didn't feel fear. For the first time in years, she felt the exhilarating, terrifying lightness of being completely and utterly free. She had no way of knowing that her act of defiance hadn't ended her story with Arthur Sterling. It had just torn up the first draft and started a new, far more dangerous one. The euphoria of freedom lasted for the precise duration of one bus ride and a fitful night's sleep. It carried her through the shocked and secretly admiring stares of her former co-workers, past a pale Jean-Pierre who could only mutter, "Bonne chance," and out into the biting Chicago wind. But freedom, Clara discovered, with the harsh clarity of morning, didn't pay for Leo's custom-fitted leg braces, nor did it satisfy the landlord who believed sentiment was a poor substitute for currency. By noon the next day, the reality of her situation had descended like the city's signature grey winter sky. She was unemployed. Worse, she was likely blacklisted. The fine dining world of Chicago was a small, gossipy village. The story of the waitress who psychoanalyzed and then ceremonially drowned Arthur Sterling's 1982 Margot would be the appetizer at every staff meal in the city. Her career in high-end service was over. She spent the afternoon hunched over her small drafting table, sketching the faces of fellow bus passengers from memory, the charcoal a poor outlet for the anxiety coiling in her gut. She circled ads for diner waitresses and coffee shop baristas, calculating hours and tips, her heart sinking with each equation. Despair was a cold, creeping thing. She was staring out at the brick wall of the building opposite hers when her apartment buzzer blared, a sound so harsh and alien it made her jump. Expecting a delivery for a neighbor, she pressed the intercom button. "Yes?" A voice, calm and cultured, answered with impossible clarity through the cheap speaker. "Miss Clara Sullivan. My name is Marcus Thorne. I represent the office of Mr. Arthur Sterling." Clara's blood turned to ice water. He had sent his lawyer. To sue her for the cost of the wine? For slander? For public humiliation? The defiance of the previous night curdled into raw, primal fear. I have nothing to say to Mr. Sterling," she stammered. "He isn't asking you to speak, Miss Sullivan. He is requesting a moment of your time. I can assure you it is not for the reason you might fear. May I come up?" A sliver of morbid curiosity, warring with every instinct for self-preservation, won out. What could the man who had everything possibly want from the woman who had just spectacularly thrown her life's necessities away? She buzzed him in. The man who knocked on her door a few minutes later was the antithesis of Arthur Sterling. Where Sterling was a storm of sharp edges and cold fury, Marcus Thorne was an island of quiet dignity. He was in his late 60s, with a neatly trimmed grey moustache, kind, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and a tweed blazer that spoke of academia rather than a corporate boardroom. He held a simple manila folder. "Miss Sullivan," he said, offering a small, reassuring smile. "Thank you for seeing me." "I'm not sure I had much of a choice," she replied, hugging her arms to her chest. Her small apartment, her sanctuary filled with sketches, and the scent of oil paints, felt suddenly invaded and vulnerable. "One always has a choice," Marcus said, his eyes taking in the charcoal portraits taped to the walls, his expression one of genuine interest, not judgment. "In fact, that is precisely why I am here. Mr. Sterling was impressed." Clara stared at him. "Impressed? I insulted him, destroyed his property, and quit in the most dramatic way possible. What part of that was impressive?" "The part where you were right," Marcus stated simply, "and the part where you were not afraid. Arthur is surrounded by a vacuum of agreement. He is insulated by men and women who are paid handsomely to fear him. Last night, you gave him an honest, unfiltered analysis, free of charge. He finds that novel." He stepped forward and placed the manila folder on her cluttered coffee table. "He is offering you a position." Clara was certain she had misheard. This had to be a cruel, elaborate prank. A position? Doing what? Polishing his shoes with my tears? A genuine smile touched Marcus's lips. Something a bit more complex. He wants to create a role for you. Analyst, Special Projects, within the CEO's office. The title was so absurdly corporate and vague that Clara almost laughed. You can't be serious. I'm a waitress. I have a 2-year degree in fine arts. My only skill is drawing people and guessing when they want more water. Your skill, Miss Sullivan, is observation, Marcus corrected gently. You don't just see people, you perceive them. You noticed the sommelier's tremor. You deduced its origin. You connected it to the wine. That is a data processing and analysis skill of an extremely high and rare order. Mr. Sterling believes that if you can deconstruct the subtle dynamics of a dining room, you might be able to do the same for a boardroom or a factory floor. He opened the folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was a formal letter of offer. Clara's eyes scanned the text and landed on the salary figure. She stopped breathing. It wasn't just a living wage. It was a life-changing wage. It was enough to cover Leo's therapy, the rent, her art supplies, and still have enough left over to actually save. It was a golden parachute offered by the very man who had pushed her out of the plane. "Why?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "This makes no sense. Is this some kind of revenge? To own me? To make my life miserable every day?" Marcus's expression grew serious. "I have worked for the Sterling family for 40 years, first for Arthur's father, and now for him. He is a difficult, brilliant, and deeply wounded man. He is a force of nature, yes, but he is not petty. Revenge is an inefficient allocation of resources, as he would say. This is not about revenge, Miss Sullivan. It is about an asset. He believes you are one. He is making an investment to see if his assessment is correct." He gestured to the letter. "The offer includes a comprehensive health insurance plan for you and your immediate family. It would take effect immediately. I am aware of your brother's situation." The mention of Leo was a deliberate, calculated move. They knew. Of course, a man like Sterling could find out anything. This wasn't just a job offer. It was a bespoke solution to her most desperate, private prayer. It felt less like an opportunity and more like a gilded, velvet-lined trap. She sank onto her lumpy sofa, her mind a whirlwind of pride and pragmatism. Work for him? The embodiment of the arrogant privilege she despised? The architect of her own professional demise? It was a deal with a devil in a bespoke suit, but that devil was offering to pay for Leo's chance to walk again. "What would I have to do?" she asked, her voice hollow. "You would work directly for him," Marcus explained. "You would be present in meetings. You would review personnel files. You would walk the factory floors. You would observe. And you would report to him, and only to him, on the human dynamics you witness, on the tells, the tensions, the unspoken truths that do not appear on any spreadsheet. Your sole duty would be to provide him with your unique perspective. And if I say no?" "If you say no," Marcus said, his voice softening with empathy, "then I will thank you for your time, and you will never hear from us again. As I said, Miss Sullivan, you have a choice." Clara looked at the offer letter. She pictured Leo's face, the frustration and hope that warred in his eyes every single day. Her pride was a luxury. Her dignity was essential, but she had kept that intact. Could she walk into the lion's den every day if it meant giving her brother the weapons he needed for his own fight? Her pride was a coat she could take off. Leo's health was the roof over their heads. She picked up a charcoal pencil from the table, its tip sharp. Where do I sign? Marcus Thorne allowed himself another small, knowing smile. Welcome to Sterling Industries, Miss Sullivan. We begin Monday morning at 8. As he left, Clara was alone with the contract and the dizzying, nauseating feeling that she hadn't just taken a job. She had accepted a dare. She was stepping back into the hurricane, not as someone about to be swept away, but as someone who had been hired to chart its path. She only hoped she wouldn't be torn apart in the process. The Sterling Industries headquarters was a brutalist masterpiece of concrete and dark glass that loomed over the Chicago River, a monument to 20th century industrial might. The lobby was a cavern of polished granite and cold steel, vast and silent, designed to make visitors feel small and insignificant. Clara, wearing the one good black blazer she owned, felt like a field mouse at a convocation of eagles. Marcus Thorne met her in the lobby and escorted her to a private elevator that ascended to the top floor with a silent, unnerving velocity. Mr. Sterling's executive suite is a focused environment, Marcus explained, a master of understatement. Your office is adjacent to his. You are, for all intents and purposes, his eyes and ears. The elevator doors opened into a space of stark, intimidating minimalism. The floor was dark, polished mahogany. The walls were floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a godlike panorama of the city. It felt less like an office and more like a command center. A few individuals moved through the space with the hushed urgency of air traffic controllers. Her office was a small, glass-walled enclosure containing a simple desk, a comfortable chair, and a high-end drafting table next to the window, a detail so thoughtful and unexpected it almost threw her off balance. He's in a senior management review, Marcus said, gesturing toward a set of imposing oak doors from which no sound escaped. Your first task is to read this. He placed a thick, bound document on her desk. It was titled Sterling Industries, A Centennial History. For the first few hours, Clara read. She learned about the company's founding by Arthur's grandfather, a penniless immigrant steelworker. She read about his father, a brilliant engineer who had expanded the empire. The book was a hagiography, of course, but between the lines, she saw a story of immense pressure, of a legacy that was both a gift and a crushing weight. At precisely 11:15 a.m., the oak doors opened, and a procession of grim-faced, middle-aged men in identical grey suits filed out, looking like survivors of a plane crash. A moment later, Arthur Sterling emerged. In his own territory, he seemed larger, his presence filling the vast space. The tailored suit was his armor, the predatory energy a force field. He strode past her glass office without a glance, Marcus falling into step beside him. Their projections are cowardly, Arthur was saying, his voice a low rumble. They're forecasting based on fear of a recession, not on the strength of our product line. I want a new set of numbers on my desk by end of day, numbers based on ambition, not appeasement. Find me the person responsible for this pathetic excuse for a forecast, and have his resignation letter waiting for him. I'll handle it, Arthur, Marcus replied, his voice a steady counterpoint. Arthur stopped by the great window, staring down at the city below. Finally, he turned his head, and his pale grey eyes landed on Clara, sitting in her glass box. There was no flicker of recognition, no acknowledgement of their dramatic history. He was looking at her like a new, unfamiliar piece of equipment. You, he said, his voice carrying easily across the space. My office. Now. He turned and disappeared through the oak doors, leaving them swinging gently in his wake. Clara's heart began a frantic, thumping rhythm against her ribs. This was it. The test. She smoothed her blazer, took a deep breath, and walked into the lion's den. His office was immense and surprisingly personal. One wall was filled with books on metallurgy and engineering. Another held framed black and white photographs of factories, gears, and molten steel, images of stark, industrial beauty. He was standing behind a massive desk of reclaimed factory timber, its surface a sea of organized paper. "Mr. Thorne tells me you see things," he began without preamble. "A useless, sentimental talent, in my opinion, unless it can be monetized. I am not paying you to be a poet. I am paying you to be a tool." He gestured to a chair. She sat. He remained standing, an immediate and deliberate establishment of power. "Your first assignment. We are in the final stages of negotiating a new contract with the Machinists' Union at our Gary plant. The union boss is a man named Frank Kovac. He's old school. Tough. He's holding out for a 7% raise, which is untenable. My negotiating team says he won't budge. They say he's a stone wall." He slid a thick file across the desk. "This is his personnel file, negotiation history, everything we have on him. I want you to go to Gary tomorrow. You will not speak to him. You will not interact. You will be introduced as a junior analyst from corporate. You will simply watch him during the negotiation session, and then you will come back and tell me where the cracks are in his wall." Clara was taken aback. This was not fetching coffee. This was real. "Sir, I'm not a labor negotiator. I wouldn't know what to look for." "You knew what to look for in my wine," he retorted, a ghost of a smirk playing on his lips. "You saw a man's personal tragedy in a flake of cork. Frank Kovac is a man. Find his tragedy. Find his pride. Find his weakness, or find a new job. Is that clear?" "Perfectly," Clara said, her voice betraying none of her inner turmoil. "Good. Now, about Thursday night," he said, the sudden shift in topic designed to wrong-foot her. "You delivered a rather scathing and largely accurate assessment of my character. You said I see nothing, that I don't see people. For the duration of your employment here, you are my eyes. Show me what I'm missing. But be aware, Miss Sullivan." He leaned forward, his granite eyes locking onto hers. "If you ever, for any reason, try to use your observations to manage or analyze me, you will be gone before you can draw another breath. Your focus is outward, not inward. Understood?" "Understood," she said, meeting his gaze. "Then get out," he said, dismissing her with a wave of his hand, "and read the damn file." Clara walked out of his office, her mind reeling. He wasn't just testing her, he was weaponizing her. He was taking her unique, gentle skill of artistic observation and attempting to forge it into a corporate scalpel. As she sat down at her desk, the file on Frank Kovac open before her, she realized the true nature of her position. She was a court painter, brought in to capture the souls of the king's enemies, all while pretending the king himself was invisible. It was a dangerous, impossible game, and she had no choice but to learn how to play it. The following weeks were a baptism by fire. Clara learned the brutal, relentless rhythm of Arthur Sterling's world. He was a man who ran on black coffee, sheer willpower, and a deep-seated dissatisfaction with the universe. His temper was a constant, low-pressure system that could erupt into a hurricane at any moment. But Clara began to see it differently now. It wasn't random chaos. It was a tool he used to test for weaknesses in materials and in men. She, in turn, became ruthlessly effective. Her assignment in Gary had been a success. During the tense negotiation, she hadn't focused on Frank Kovac's words, but on his hands. He had the gnarled, scarred hands of a man who had worked the machines himself. But one finger, his ring finger, was immaculately clean, the nail buffed. He would touch it constantly when speaking about pensions and healthcare. She had reported this single detail to Arthur. "He's not fighting for his men's salary," she'd told him. "He's fighting for their future. His own is secure, but he feels responsible for theirs. The ring finger, it's about a promise. To them, to his wife. Appeal to his sense of legacy, not his wallet." Arthur had changed tactics, offering a smaller wage increase but guaranteeing pension funding for 30 years and expanding family health benefits. Kovac had accepted the deal. Arthur had simply nodded at her report when he returned, a silent, grudging acknowledgement of her value. A strange, unspoken dynamic formed between them. She was his secret weapon, and he was her unwilling patron. He never complimented her, but he began to rely on her insights. He sent her to observe board meetings, sales pitches, even a focus group for a new line of power tools. She filled sketchbooks with the unconscious tells of his executives, the vice president who rubbed his chin when he was about to exaggerate sales figures, the head of R&D who couldn't maintain eye contact when his project was behind schedule. She was a human lie detector, and Arthur used her findings with surgical precision. Her real work, however, happened in the quiet hours after the offices emptied. That was when she delved into the company archives, trying to understand the man in the corner office. She was searching for the source of the wound he guarded so fiercely. She found it in a dusty, mislabeled box of personnel files from the 1990s. It was an accident report from the Gary plant, dated over 20 years ago, a catastrophic failure in a hydraulic press. The name of the victim, a 19-year-old summer apprentice, was Daniel Sterling, Arthur's younger brother. Clara felt the air go out of her lungs. She read the brittle yellowed pages, a horrifying story unfolding. Daniel, home from his first year of college, had wanted to work on the floor, to understand the business from the ground up. He'd been assigned to a section overseen by a young, fiercely ambitious shift manager named Julian Vance. An internal memo stapled to the back of the report showed that Vance had been pushing his crews to bypass certain safety checks to meet an aggressive production quota. The hydraulic press that had failed was one of them. The official report ruled it a tragic accident, but a handwritten addendum by Arthur's father noted that Julian Vance was dismissed a week later. There was no mention of criminal charges, just a quiet, decisive removal. A quick search revealed that Julian Vance was now the CEO of Vance Capital, a notoriously aggressive private equity firm, known for hostile takeovers and asset stripping. Clara leaned back, the sterile silence of the archive room suddenly feeling heavy and cold. This was the ghost. This was the wound. Arthur wasn't just a tyrant forged by pressure. He was a man forged by grief and guilt. His obsession with control, his rage at incompetence, it all stemmed from a moment of horrific, uncontrollable loss. The brother he was supposed to protect had died in his own family's factory. The rage wasn't a personality flaw, it was a monument to his brother, a shield to protect a wound that had never healed. She now understood the source of his profound brokenness. The question was what this meant for the storm that was gathering on the horizon. For the past month, whispers had been circulating about a potential hostile takeover of Sterling Industries. The predator circling them, she now knew with sickening certainty, was Julian Vance. This wasn't business. This was a ghost returning to finish the job. The next morning, the whispers became a roar. Vance Capital officially announced its hostile takeover bid for Sterling Industries. The news hit the executive floor like a shockwave. Arthur locked himself in his office. The usual controlled tension of the company curdled into palpable fear. Clara knew she couldn't wait. She walked to his office, the accident report in a plain folder in her hands, and knocked. "Go away," he snarled from within. She knocked again, harder. "Mr. Sterling, it's Clara. It's about Julian Vance." The door was wrenched open. He stood there, his face a thunderous mask of fury. But his eyes held something else, a haunted, cornered look. "What about him?" "I know what he is to you," she said softly, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "I know about Daniel." The name hung in the air between them, a word unspoken for decades. The fury on his face collapsed, replaced by a raw, unguarded agony that was terrible to behold. The mask was gone. In its place was the heartbroken 20-something who had lost his brother. "You had no right," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You tasked me with finding the weaknesses in your enemies," she replied, her own voice steady. "But to do that, I have to understand your blind spots. Vance isn't just a corporate raider, is he? He's the man who killed your brother." He sank into his chair, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a weary, ancient grief. He was never held accountable. My father fired him, but his family was powerful. They buried it. He walked away clean, and Daniel was gone. He looked up at her, his eyes swimming with a pain he had held in for 20 years. Now he's back to take the last thing I have of my family, this company. He wants to dismantle it, sell it for scrap. He wants to destroy my father's legacy as a final insult. "So what's the plan?" Clara asked, her tone shifting from empathetic to strategic. "How do you fight him?" Arthur laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "The way I fight everyone. I'll crush him. I'll leverage the company to buy back stock. I'll find dirt on him. I'll tear his reputation to shreds. I will burn my own house down to make sure he can't have it." "And he's expecting that," Clara challenged, stepping closer to the desk. "He's counting on it. He knows you'll react with rage. He knows you'll make it a war of attrition. He's a financial predator, Mr. Sterling. You'll be fighting him on his terms, in a battle he's prepared for. He wants you to be the monster, because he knows how to slay monsters. You need a new strategy. And I suppose the waitress-turned-analyst has one?" He scoffed, the old defenses trying to reassert themselves. "He thinks he knows Arthur Sterling, the ruthless CEO," Clara said, her mind racing, connecting the pieces of the man she had been studying for weeks. "He doesn't know the man who keeps pictures of gears on his wall, because he loves the beauty of a well-made machine. He doesn't know the man who honored Frank Kovac's promise to his wife. He doesn't know the man who lost his brother. That's the man who can beat him, not with rage, with integrity." An idea, audacious and terrifying, began to crystallize in her mind. "He wants to make this about money and power. You need to make it about what it's really about. Safety, responsibility, and family. You're going to fight him not in the stock market, but on the factory floor." Arthur looked at her as if she were insane. "What are you talking about?" "You're going to launch the Daniel Sterling Memorial Initiative," she said, the words coming faster now. "A massive, company-wide investment in worker safety and education. New technologies, new training protocols, scholarships for the children of your employees in engineering and skilled trades. You're not just going to meet federal safety standards. You're going to set a new global standard. You'll announce it at the emergency shareholder meeting. You'll frame this takeover not as a financial battle, but as a moral one. You'll tell the world that Julian Vance is a man who represents a culture of cutting corners on human lives for profit, and you represent a culture of investing in them." The sheer audacity of the plan left him speechless. It was a move so completely out of character, so contrary to his public persona, that it was utterly brilliant. It would blindside Vance. It turned his greatest weakness, his past trauma, into his most powerful weapon. A new light began to dawn in Arthur's granite eyes. Not the cold fire of rage, but the glint of a master strategist seeing a move on the chessboard he had never conceived. For the first time, he looked at Clara not as an employee or a strange tool, but as an equal, an ally. He'll call it a stunt, Arthur mused, testing the strategy. A desperate PR move. And you'll have the accident report to prove this has been a private pain for 20 years, Clara countered. You'll have the memory of your brother. You won't be fighting for Sterling Industries' stock price. You'll be fighting for Daniel's legacy. You won't be a CEO protecting his assets. You'll be a brother protecting his family. Let's see a private equity ghoul fight. That. The silence in the room was thick with possibility. Arthur stood and walked to the great window, looking down at the city. This time, he didn't look like he wanted to own it. He looked like he wanted to protect it. "Get Marcus in here," Arthur said, his voice firm, a new, cold resolve in his tone. "And get our communications team on a secure line. Find me the foreman from the Gary plant who was on duty that day, the one who signed the initial report. Find out what it would take to get him to tell the truth." He turned to face her, and the ghost that had haunted his eyes for 2 decades was, for the moment, gone. In its place was a clear, focused light. Let's give Mr. Vance a fight he never saw coming. Clara felt a surge of pure, focused adrenaline. This was it. The unlikely alliance was forged. The broken billionaire and the waitress who had had enough. Together, they were going to war. And for the first time, Arthur Sterling wasn't fighting out of anger. He was fighting for love. And that, Clara knew, made him invincible. The days leading up to the emergency shareholder meeting were a whirlwind of controlled chaos. The top floor of Sterling Industries became a war room. Arthur, Clara, and Marcus formed an unlikely triumvirate, working 18-hour days fueled by coffee and a shared, grim purpose. Clara was no longer just an observer. She was a core strategist. She worked with the communications team to craft the narrative for the Daniel Sterling Memorial Initiative, ensuring it was rooted in authenticity, not corporate spin. She spent hours on the phone with engineers and safety experts, learning the language of risk assessment and preventative technology. She saw a side of Arthur she never could have imagined. The rage was gone, transmuted into a laser-focused determination. When he spoke of the new safety protocols, of ensuring no other family endured what his had, his voice carried a weight of conviction that was more powerful than any of his previous tirades. In return, he began to see her as more than an asset. He asked about Leo, not as a formality, but with genuine interest. He listened as she described the grueling physical therapy sessions and the small, hard-won victories. One evening, he quietly had Marcus arrange for Leo's entire medical file to be sent to a leading neuromuscular research institute in Boston, an institute Sterling Industries had anonymously supported for years. It was a gesture of profound gratitude, offered without a word. Meanwhile, Marcus Thorne, the loyal consigliere, was on a different mission. He was hunting a ghost. He was trying to find David Chen, the foreman who had been on shift the day Daniel died. Chen had retired and moved to Arizona years ago, disappearing into the sun-drenched anonymity of a retirement community. Marcus flew there personally. He found a man in his late 70s, haunted by a 2-decade-old secret. Chen confessed that Julian Vance's family had paid him a substantial sum to remain silent about the bypassed safety checks, a sum that had put his own children through college. The guilt had been his constant companion ever since. He agreed to sign a sworn affidavit. The day of the meeting arrived. The grand ballroom of a downtown hotel was packed. The atmosphere was thick with tension and the scent of expensive cologne. Julian Vance and his team from Vance Capital sat at the front, looking smug and predatory. They had spent weeks buying up stock and swaying institutional investors. They believed they had Arthur cornered, that the only thing left was to watch him flail. The meeting began with Vance's presentation. It was slick, brutal, and effective. He used charts and graphs to portray Sterling Industries as a bloated, inefficient relic. He spoke of unlocking shareholder value, a euphemism for layoffs and liquidation. He painted Arthur as a temperamental dinosaur, clinging to a bygone era. Then it was Arthur's turn. He walked to the podium, not with a binder full of financial counter-arguments, but with a single folded piece of paper in his hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice calm, resonant, filling the vast room. "Mr. Vance has presented a compelling vision for the future of our company's stock price. I am here today to talk about its soul." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. He unfolded the paper. 22 years ago, my younger brother, Daniel, was killed in an accident at our plant in Gary, Indiana. A shocked murmur rippled through the audience. Vance's confident smirk faltered. This was not on the agenda. For the next 10 minutes, Arthur told them everything. He spoke of his brother's love for the company, his desire to learn it from the floor up. He spoke of the hydraulic press, the bypassed safety checks, and the ambitious young manager who had prioritized production quotas over human life. He didn't name Vance. Not yet. He spoke of his own guilt, of the decades he spent channeling his grief into anger and a ruthless obsession with control. His voice was thick with an emotion no one in that room had ever heard from him before, but it never broke. It was the confession of a broken man finally willing to show his scars. Then he looked up, his pale grey eyes sweeping across the room until they locked onto Julian Vance. "The man responsible for my brother's death is in this room today. He now seeks to finish the job, to dismantle the company Daniel loved, to sell for scrap the legacy my father and grandfather built. He offers you profit built on a foundation of moral bankruptcy." He then laid out the Daniel Sterling Memorial Initiative, not as a proposal, but as a promise. He announced he was personally placing $1 billion of his own shares into a trust to fund it in perpetuity. It was a masterstroke. He was sacrificing his own wealth to protect his workers, a direct refutation of Vance's asset-stripping philosophy. Vance was ashen-faced. "This is a pathetic, desperate stunt," he shouted from his seat, his composure shattering. "An emotional ploy to manipulate the vote." "Is it?" Arthur asked calmly. He nodded to Marcus, who was standing by the ballroom doors. The doors opened, and Marcus walked in, escorting a frail but resolute David Chen to the podium. "This is David Chen," Arthur announced. He was the foreman on duty the day my brother died. Chen, his voice trembling but clear, read his sworn affidavit into the microphone. He detailed the pressure from Vance, the specific safety protocols that were ignored, and the subsequent payoff to ensure his silence. It was a devastating, irrefutable testimony. The story was no longer about finances. It was about justice. The vote was a mere formality. Vance Capital's bid was rejected by a staggering margin. The board then voted to launch a full investigation, not only into market manipulation, but also to petition the district attorney to reopen the investigation into Daniel Sterling's death. Julian Vance didn't just lose a takeover battle, he lost his future. He was a disgraced pariah before he even left the room. When the ballroom finally cleared, only 3 people remained amidst the debris of coffee cups and discarded agendas: Arthur, Clara, and Marcus. The silence was not tense, but serene. Arthur walked over to Clara, who was standing by the window, looking out at the city lights. You said I was blind, he said quietly, that I didn't see people. You were right. I spent 20 years looking at my brother's ghost instead of honoring his life. He held out his hand, not as a boss to an employee, but as one human being to another. Thank you, Clara. She shook it, her grip firm. You were the one who had the courage to tell the truth, Mr. Sterling. Arthur, he corrected her, a faint, genuine smile touching his lips for the first time she could remember. My friends call me Arthur. She smiled back. Clara, the aftermath was not a storybook ending, but a slow, deliberate reconstruction. Arthur, true to his word, poured himself into the foundation, transforming Sterling Industries from the inside out. He was still demanding, still intense, but the brutal, personal rage was gone, replaced by an unwavering, purposeful drive. Clara was given a new title, Vice President of Human Systems, and a permanent, powerful role in the company. She used her salary to move Leo to the facility in Boston, where new treatments gave him hope he hadn't had in years. She never stopped sketching, but now her subjects were the proud, hopeful faces of the workers whose lives she was helping to protect. There were no dramatic declarations or Hollywood romances. Their relationship was something quieter and more profound, a partnership forged in crisis, built on a foundation of mutual respect and a shared understanding of how a single act of courage could mend a broken world. Standing high above the city that had once been their battlefield, the Billionaire and the Waitress were no longer defined by their stations, but by the future they had chosen to build from the wreckage of the past.